here's some of Regan's intuitions. I want to point out that there's more to Regan's what he calls cumulative argument, but this logical outline, there's nothing that justifies intuitions, okay? So he intuits that normal and mentally disabled humans have equal inherent value, or a strong right to respect because things matter to them as subjects of a life. Therefore, humans deserve rights. Non-human animals share mental capabilities with mentally disabled humans. Therefore, non-human animals also deserve rights. It's a poor argument because of its intuitionism. And he's basically jumping to conclusions all over the place. The other thing is, I love Regan as a person. He's a great person. If you ever see him speak, it's a privilege. He's a model of genteel courtesy, clarity, the way he talks, integrity, and he's a great historical pioneer in animal rights theory. So, again, I'm not being negative about anyone. I'm just being critical in an academic sense. So, the thing is, if people are complacent about intuitionism, it can very quickly be turned around against them. Here's an argument, an intuitionist argument for anthropocentrism, or being centered overly on humanity. Human forms of life are generally cognitively superior over non-human forms of life, as an alleged fact. Obviously, there's exceptions. Some gorillas are vastly more intelligent than some mentally disabled humans, and a lot of speciesists will agree with that. But it's a generalization they're interested in, not a perfect truth. The intuition, beings with higher mental functions should count for more in ethics than those with lesser mental functioning. And such beings possess a greater dignity, okay? And they will say, well, isn't it obvious? I mean, who would you save, a human being or a fruit fly? So they would say, that's because we have this intuition. Therefore, we should count non-human animals generally for less in ethics, according to them, a lesser dignity, okay? So if you accept intuitionism, you're in danger of accepting this sort of argument. And this sort of argument is dripping with invisible red. So intuitions are weak given our two areas of criticism. They're not evidently true, and I don't believe that they're self-evidently true. And the other thing is they don't validly entail conclusions, because if we're impartial, we'll look at a whole range of theoretical intuitions, and they lead to all kinds of conclusions all over the place. What kind of logical validity is that? So animals have an interest in not being property, says Francione. What's the evidence? Does it follow if you have intuitions from all the other theories? No, it does not. Rights based in compassion. Okay, so we learned a bit about that last time. People's compassion is highly variable. If you just appeal to people's sympathy or empathy, you're not going to get a consistent result. Again, it could just mean longer chains for the slaves. The other thing is that there's no justification in this argumentation that I've seen as to why compassion is appropriate, or certain forms of it. We're going to discuss the feminist ethic of care later, and that has a lot of relevant issues. So without further ado, tradition-based theories, right? The intuition that ethics from common sense or everyday morality is legitimate, and there's radically different content. Rollin just says animals have the right to be discussed, which is pathetic. And Saponsis says that we should promote moral character, reduce suffering, increase enjoyment, and fairly distribute benefits and unavoidable harms. So what are some negative criticisms that it would be responsible to iterate? Well, with Saponsis, everyday morality includes anthropocentrism. It includes speciesism every single day. Peter Carruthers is another animal ethics guy, but he's against liberation of animals. And he says that common sense validates factory farming and laboratory testing on animals without qualification. So common sense is going to get you some uncommonly different things. The other thing is that common sense can be wrong. Geocentrism was once the common sense of humanity, that the earth is the center of the universe. It was nonsense. The other thing is that all major theories are part of our cultural heritage, so in a sense, they're all part of our common sense tradition. Therefore, the appeal to common sense is utterly inconclusive. What about Bernard's Rollin's common sense idea? Okay, the same four criticisms of Saponsis' traditionalism apply, but also he's saying that animals only have the right to be discussed, which is too weak. He says the reason for this is Kant's principle of ought implies can. Okay, ought implies can means that it looks mysterious written in 3 words like that, but it's not mysterious if it's clarified just a little bit. If someone says, you ought to turn back time and erase speciesism from the face of the earth, you're obviously confronting a radical advocate of falsehood and inanity and nonsense. It doesn't make sense to say you ought to do what's impossible. That's really what the old master's trying to say. I mean, you can say people ought to do the impossible, but it's not very relevant or productive. So Rollin is saying, well, let's lean on this principle and say, you can't say we ought to liberate animals totally because we can't do that right now. Just look around. Well, let's root ourselves in reality again, Dr. Rollin, and acknowledge that we can advocate animal liberation and perhaps we can achieve it eventually. It's just a long-term project. Just because something's difficult does not mean that it's impossible. That's a logical confusion. Okay. So here's another radical critique of all the rights theorists that we've looked at. And it's the critique that the rights theories do not logically entail rights. There's 2 slides I'm looking at here. Here's the 6 kinds of rights theory. And you'll notice that all of them can lead to individual rights, utilitarianism, the ethic of care, or even anything goes. Because you can intuit any of those things. Compassion is radically variable. Tradition can say just about anything. You can universalize anything. You can indicate anything from the original position. And anyone can agree that you should treat like things alike. It doesn't really get you very far, logically. And everyone can agree, okay, you need some well-being and freedom to act, says Gewerth. Big deal. So, yeah, that's the critique that I'm launching here, which is featured in your reading, The Rights of Animal Persons. That you can universalize any theory, contra Kant. Any theory can be based in reflective intuitions, contra Regan. Contra means against. Francion's equal consideration principle is compatible with any ethical theory. It means treating like things alike unless a good reason to do otherwise. The veil of ignorance and so on. I've already said for a few of them already, so I'm not going to repeat myself. I've already established it in previous remarks. These theories of rights are logically empty. You can drive any moral theoretical truck through these loopholes. And this is a problem of logical invalidity, premises from which the conclusion of rights does not follow. Okay? Logical invalidity does not follow. And mine is, although some people might think I'm mean who are partial to these theories, I'm actually being generous here because what I'm doing is I'm granting these rights theorists their coveted premises, which is a lot to do in ethical academic theory, giving someone what they want to assume. I'm saying, okay, let's assume that. Sorry, friends, you don't get to where you want to go. Okay, what about the Franken theory of rights? Here I'm referring to the monster I created in question period last class. I said, take rights to life, liberty, and welfare. You could have that from behind the veil of ignorance. You can intuit it. base it in tradition, compassion. In other words, all the different rights theories can be combined into one. Well, my point here is that, these problems pertaining to the different rights theories make it very problematic to just throw together the different rights theorists. It still does demonstrate that proponents of these theories of rights are natural political allies. And that's very important because I want to be political allies with all these rights people to get things done. But, it's not so great to start with any of these or to end with all of them together. And so the death of my Frankenstein's monster is perhaps inevitable from the decaying parts which are hashed together. All right, utilitarianism. Here's another monster. So you have the value theory that's intuited that good equals pleasure, bad equals pain is one example. Intuition of the equal consideration of equivalent interests. So not so serious interests do not rank with serious interests. That's what equivalent means. Maximizing good and minimizing bad overall. And last time we saw that the choice to vivisect or not, the utilitarians often favor medical vivisection because they say that we can end up with endlessly repeatable cures, inflicting a finite amount of harm or limited amount of harm on animals, and deriving endless cures, whereas the not vivisecting, you result in endlessly persisting disease, they argue, rather tendentiously, and allowing endless harm to patients. Of course, a lot of this is not nonsense, but very poor thinking, because if you look closely at the science literature, you realize, again, as I said last time, that inferences about human health don't tell you what non-human health is like, and the same goes for the illnesses. Many studies have thrown out over 80% of drugs tested safe and effective on animals when they get to human clinical trials. And again, that's worse than flipping a coin. But the point is, utilitarianism actually does, although many people find the violence that it rationalizes at times to be monstrous, like I do, it does seem to be fair because it counts everyone's interests equally. It calls attention to the importance of results or consequences, and surely those are important. It says that going purely by rules will easily lead to conflicts of rules. Last time we gave the rather hackneyed example of the person rescuing a child on their way to meeting a friend and breaking the promise to meet them at a certain time. Conflict of rules. And utilitarianism proposes a way of settling conflicts between rules, at least in theory. It's flexible and sensitive to different contexts. And it's plausible that rational agents should want to pursue what's best in some sense. So utilitarianism actually has a lot going for it. And you have to give these gentlemen and lots of women and many adherents lots of credit for their views. But on the downside, I'm only going to mention one criticism here because I develop others elsewhere. But it seems to me that utilitarianism suffers from the problem of what I call in that article that you're, as part of the readings, non-sentientism. And a sentient being, we've already been introduced to what that is. So a non-sentient being is a being that doesn't have a consciousness in such a way that they have affect or desires and feelings. And a non-sentientist theory takes a non-sentient thing and says, in effect, that we should ultimately act for the thing. Does it make sense to ultimately act for the egg timer? No. Does it make sense to act for an idea such as freedom? No. We act for freedom because it benefits sentient beings. At least we do if we're coherent, that we do things because they should be significant, and significance exists in relation to sentient beings. Well, I'm saying that if we act for the maximum number of utility units, the most pleasure and the least pain, utility units are things. And glomming them all together and acting ultimately for that, that's non-sentientism. My own theory that I elaborate indicates that, no, if we're sentientists, then we ultimately act in relation to each and every sentient being. And that is very coherent with individual rights and dignity. If I equally act ultimately for all of you and try to respect all of you, it's not best for any of you to be vivisected. So it tends to falsify the monstrous utilitarian conclusion in favor of medical vivisection, for example. So that theory is non-sentientist. My theory is thoroughly sentientist, or so I argue. All right, what about virtue ethics? They intuit a list of virtues and say we ought to act according to them. Well, it's not caught up in consequences alone, which some interpret as a good thing. In theory, it allows for people to have sturdy and reliable characters of various things. But on the negative side, it's also intuitionist, and it's very vague as well. You could intuit a warrior set of virtues and go out and think that you have to go out there and conquer everyone. Or Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, had a very violent conception of virtue as well. Ethical egoism, well, at least on the plus side, it gets thoroughly self-interested people to at least try to have some regard for others. On the downside, there doesn't seem to be any special reason why ego should count for something and not anyone else. If someone says, well, it's me, I mean, that's not going to stand up to academic scrutiny. Or if someone says that they have outstanding virtues, well, there's always someone who can do something better than us, right? So ethical egoism has problematic basis. It seems that ethical egoism to me is rather rooted in just ignoring others and having one's own concerns being especially vivid to oneself, because of course one has one's own feelings and desires, and it's too easy for people to not to have any sense of the sentience of others. So naturally, another liability is that it can result in great violence, not only towards non-human animals, but human animals too. Quite frankly, I find it unbelievable that people who are thoroughly self-interested would result in a wonderful society. I've met self-centered people, and I've interacted with them, and they tend to be hostile, abusive, ungenerous, and the kind of people you want to steer clear of. So that's not my vision of morality. Pragmatism, another noble idea to be sure. I mean, on the plus side, it's flexible, very practical. It allows for skepticism about absolutes, which many see as a very important, just a true thing. I don't necessarily agree, but I respect the people who disagree. So, there's a lot going for pragmatism, academically speaking. So you can see the intuitions there at the bottom, what works and so on, what people like. But of course, that's radically variable too. And that's part of the negative critique, is that it could mean anything. What works for one person will not necessarily work for another. And we won't go into detail about ecoholism. I'm just going to use 3 words, ladies and gentlemen. Intuitionist, environmental fascism. That's all I'm going to say about ecoholism. The feminist ethic of care, I've got more to say about, because of course Paul's going to be talking about ecoholism. And actually we're in a position to be treated to a presentation, I think, on atoms, is it, later as well? Yes. Which is great. So the article in the readings talks about some positive points of the ethic of care, just like there are positive points about rights theories, utilitarianism, and all the views we've looked at. Perhaps it's true that people do not live their lives obsessed with abstractions and ideas. Rather, perhaps people navigate a kind of network of caring relationships, including professional relationships when you go to the doctor or you go to school, friendly and familial relationships, or relationships with those we love. The other thing is that the ethic of care views individuals not just in isolation, but it looks at relationships between individuals and gives dignity to that. And I think that's very special, and I'm not being sarcastic, it is. I cherish the loves in my life, the likes and so on. The relations with people that I have anyway are precious to me. The other thing is that people generally, I think you might agree, do what they care about. I care very much about animal rights, and that accounts for a lot of why I'm here today. So caring really fits well with a theory of moral motivation. And the more you study ethics, the more you realize that moral motivation has got to be significant. It is flexible and sensitive to contexts that differ, like utilitarianism is or claims to be in its way. It bursts the stereotype of moral theorists as cold and uncaring. And the other thing is that you really need caring because if you didn't care about anything, you would be catatonic. You wouldn't have any desires. You would be like this. You get the idea. And you need to care in the right way, or you could be a psychopath. And I'm not going to demonstrate that. I couldn't very well anyway. But there are some problems with the ethic of care as well. It does disdain universal or abstract principles, but that comes with a price, because then caring comes down to particular caring relationships. And as I said earlier, those are radically variable. Not everyone cares about the same persons or things. And to me, it doesn't seem to take reasoning or justification seriously in ethics. It just kind of sweeps them aside and says that reasoning in ethics is kind of a patriarchal notion. But that seems based in sexist stereotypes that men are associated with rationality. I mean, women are obviously rational too. And don't we want to get away from the sexist stereotypes, not veer towards them? The other thing is that you can empathize with an aggressor. You can imagine what their viewpoint is like, and that can lead you even to sympathize with an aggressor. And there's always some lunatic who, upon hearing news about some psychopathic serial killer, starts writing fan letters to them while they're in prison and other creepy things like that. So, that's sympathy and empathy too, in particular form, not governed by a universal principle. And it's sometimes very morally ugly. We're almost done here, and then we'll break soon. Empathy, getting a sense of what it's like to be someone else, if it's successful, to the extent that it's successful, replicates the point of view of someone else, which kind of sounds ridiculous because how can you really do that? But you can aim for it, and there's nothing crazy about that. But the thing is, suppose I'm successful to some extent, and I replicate someone else's point of view, with a lot of help from them, presumably. What does that accomplish? It doesn't necessarily tell me what I ought to do. They could be anyone. It could be Charles Manson. It could be just about anyone. So it leads to ethical subjectivism or ethical nihilism, where you have nothing really to guide you. I or anyone else can abuse empathy, get a sense of how someone ticks from their own point of view to manipulate their motivations and so on. And that is obviously very morally ugly. People tend to be very biased in the way they have empathy or sympathy. They, in fact, tend to empathize and or sympathize towards others that are more like themselves. More people tend to empathize with dogs than with crocodiles. Crocodiles do have important interests of their own, vital interests to themselves. Well, we're not going to get too much into that. The other thing is that empathy is really hard. It is so hard. It's really hard even with the people you care most about in the world. You could love someone with the whole of your being and yet find yourself fumbling and unable to get a sense of what it's like to be them as much as you would want it. So it's really, really hard. So it's no easy basis for ethics, is it? But even if we did have perfect empathy, it would not guarantee respectful treatment, because perfect empathy would just mean an awareness of what it's like to be someone else. Well, here's an assertion for you, which I think is true. We can have a lucid sense of how we are ourselves, never mind a lucid sense of someone else's point of view. And you don't necessarily respect yourself just because you have a sense of yourself. So respect following from care, that's a non sequitur, which I had written earlier. So I am trying to devise an ethical theory that's animal liberationist, that has all of the strengths of all the different ethical theories, but that is not a Frankenstein monster that just throws them all together, and has none of the theoretical weaknesses that I have iterated in my critiques. In a later lecture, when I talk about nonviolence as the basis of ethics, I will offer a few hints about what an adequate theory might look like, but it will not be a complete theory owing to the necessities of what's going on here. But you'll see in the reading, The Rights of Animal Persons, that there is a chart, and it shows how best caring theory, which I articulate there, is said to have all the advantages of all the moral theories, but none of the disadvantages, which are also listed in my table. And the editor of the Animal Liberation Philosophy and Policy Journal wrote in his introduction to the issue that my theory has the advantages but not the disadvantage of the other theories. And I'm very proud of that because he sees the merit. But you know what? Let's conclude on a good note. Let's say that I love animal rights, I love veganism, and I love that you came out tonight to hear about vegan animal rights theory. A little love to everybody in the audience.